Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories.
Berlin 1884.
Europe's most powerful empires gathered around a table to divide a continent they did not control, but intended to.
Britain wanted security, France wanted prestige, Germany wanted its place among the great powers, Belgium wanted profit. And sitting among them was a delegation from a country that had just become one of the fastest-growing industrial powers in the world. The United States was no longer a fragile republic on the edge of the Atlantic. It had railroads that crossed a continent, factories that outproduced much of Europe, and a population larger than most of the nations in that room. It had the money, it had the ships, it had the ambition. So the Europeans watched it carefully. Which piece would America demand? When the discussion turned from principles to territory, from speeches to maps, every major power began marking out claims. Rivers, coastlines, interior regions. Lines were drawn in ink that would become borders enforced by rifles. And then the Americans did something unexpected. They did not claim a colony. They did not demand a protectorate. They did not send a fleet to secure a foothold. They hesitated. That hesitation confused the room because the United States was not weak, it was not isolated, and it was certainly not unfamiliar with expansion. In fact, at that very moment, it was finishing a scramble of its own. To understand why the United States did not join Europe in dividing Africa, we have to look at what kind of empire America was already becoming, and what kind of empire it refused to be. When the Berlin Conference formally opened in November 1884, it was presented as a diplomatic effort to prevent war among European powers. The stated goal was coordination, rules for navigation, recognition of territorial claims, and procedures for future annexations. But beneath the language of cooperation lay competition. Every delegation understood that delay meant disadvantage. The American representative, John A. Casson, did not arrive as a conqueror. He carried no secret colonial charter, and no naval fleet waited offshore. Yet his presence mattered. The United States had just overtaken many European economies in industrial growth. Its agricultural exports fed Europe. Its capital markets were expanding. It was no longer peripheral to global power. That rise made European leaders wary. Germany, newly unified, was eager to prove itself as a colonial competitor. Britain guarded its maritime supremacy carefully. France sought prestige after its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. None of them could ignore a rapidly industrializing republic that might decide to enter the imperial race. Casson spoke in the language of commerce and navigation. The United States supported freedom of trade along major African waterways, especially the Congo River. It endorsed principles that would prevent exclusive monopolies. To European ears, this sounded restrained, but not harmless. Open access, limited colonial advantage. When discussions shifted from principles to possession, the atmosphere sharpened. European powers formalized claims based on coastal footholds and military presence. They demanded recognition of effective occupation, a rule designed to justify future expansion inland. Maps became instruments of policy. The United States did not press a territorial claim. It supported guarantees of trade access and then stepped back from the territorial negotiations. There was no dramatic confrontation, no walkout, just an absence of demand. To European observers, the message was ambiguous. Was America uninterested? Was it cautious? Or was it calculating something different? What made the hesitation striking was not the lack of opportunity, but the lack of urgency. Other powers feared being left behind. The United States did not behave like a nation afraid of missing its chance. That calm only makes sense when seen against what was happening across the Atlantic, on a continent where expansion was already violent, contested, and nearly complete. While European diplomats traced borders across Africa, the United States was finishing the transformation of its own continent. The frontier was not a metaphor in the 1880s. It was a line of forts, railheads, and battlefields stretching across the Great Plains and into the Southwest. Expansion was not debated in theory. It was enforced in practice. The Indian Wars were still within living memory. Campaigns against the Sioux, Cheyenne, Apache, and other nations had reshaped the interior of North America through displacement and violence. Wounded Knee would occur only a few years later. Railroads cut through lands that had been home to indigenous societies for generations, tying remote territories to eastern markets. At the same time, land speculation and industrial consolidation accelerated. Railroad barons secured massive federal land grants. Mining companies extracted silver and copper from newly integrated territories. Farmers flooded westward under the promise of homesteads. The United States was not turning away from expansion. It was completing one of the largest territorial consolidations in modern history. By 1890, the Census Bureau would declare the frontier closed. That announcement did not mean the end of inequality or conflict. It meant that contiguous continental space had been absorbed into a single political system. For American policymakers in the 1880s, however, that absorption was still underway. Resources remained abundant. Land remained available. Opportunity felt domestic, not distant. This reality complicates any simple narrative of restraint. The United States was not morally opposed to empire. It had exercised force, redrawn boundaries, and integrated vast territories under federal authority. The methods were often brutal. The scale was immense. In effect, America had already conducted a scramble, just not in Africa. That fact reframes the hesitation in Berlin. If the United States was capable of expansion and not inexperienced in using power, its decision not to seize African territory cannot be explained by innocence or weakness. Something else shaped the calculation. By the mid-1880s, America's Continental project was nearing completion. Industrial capacity was expanding rapidly, and as factories multiplied and output surged, a new question emerged in Washington and New York alike. Where would all this production go?
The answer to that question would define the kind of power the United States intended to become.
As American factories multiplied and rail networks stitched the continent together, a new anxiety began to surface in political debate. Industrial growth created surplus goods, surplus capital, surplus ambition. Some policymakers argued that overseas expansion was the natural next step. Others warned that crossing the ocean would change the country in ways it did not fully understand. The memory of 1776 still shaped American political identity. The United States had been founded in revolt against imperial rule. To acquire overseas colonies populated by people who would not become full citizens raised uncomfortable questions. Would governing distant territories require standing armies and centralized authority? Would it blur the line between republic and empire? These concerns were not abstract. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, proposals surfaced to annex Santo Domingo, to assert stronger control over Cuba, and to formalize American influence in Hawaii. Each proposal ignited controversy. Expansionists spoke of markets and security. Critics spoke of constitutional limits and moral contradiction. Africa intensified the dilemma. Unlike Western territories that could eventually become states, African colonies would sit permanently across an ocean. Their populations would not be integrated into the Union in the same way. Administering such territories would resemble the European imperial systems Americans had long criticized. At Berlin, then, hesitation was not simply economic, it was ideological. Entering the scramble for Africa meant openly embracing the identity of an overseas empire. It meant acknowledging that the United States was willing to compete in the same manner as Britain or France, to claim land far from its shores and govern it indefinitely. That was a step many American leaders were not prepared to take in the mid-1880s. The country was powerful, but it was still deciding what that power meant. Continental expansion could be framed as destiny. Overseas empire required a new justification. And yet, industrial pressure did not disappear. Steel mills in Pennsylvania and textile factories in New England were producing beyond domestic demand. Farmers were exporting grain at increasing scale. Economic growth demanded external markets. If the United States did not want to become Europe, did not want to seize colonies in Africa, it still needed a way to project influence outward. The solution would not be territorial. It would be strategic. If the United States was reluctant to claim African territory, it was not reluctant to expand its influence. The difference lay in method. By the 1880s, American policymakers were beginning to experiment with a model of power that relied less on formal sovereignty and more on access. At Berlin, that instinct appeared in the insistence on free navigation and open commerce along the Congo River. The American delegation did not demand a colony. It demanded guarantees. Access to trade routes meant access to markets. Access to markets meant industrial growth could continue without the costs of colonial administration. This approach fit comfortably within a broader strategic framework. Since 1823, the Monroe Doctrine had warned European powers against expanding their influence in the Western Hemisphere. Over time, that doctrine evolved from a defensive statement into a claim of regional authority. The United States would tolerate European empires elsewhere, so long as they did not intrude too close to home. In practice, this meant Washington focused on consolidating influence in Latin America and the Caribbean. Trade agreements, naval patrols, and diplomatic pressure reinforced American primacy in its hemisphere. Control of nearby sea lanes mattered more than distant African coasts. Geography reduced costs, proximity increased leverage. Economic logic reinforced the strategy. Overseas colonies required garrisons, administrators, and permanent defense commitments. Commercial access required treaties and ships. One tied a nation to the burdens of governance, the other preserved flexibility. For a country still balancing industrial expansion with political debate, flexibility was attractive. Liberia offered a symbolic complement to this model. Though not formally a colony, its long-standing ties to the United States allowed American officials to point to an existing presence in Africa. Missionaries and merchants could operate without the spectacle of conquest. It was a limited foothold, but it softened the perception of absence. By the late 1880s, the pattern was clear. The United States sought markets without maps. It pursued influence without partition. European empires measured power by acreage. America was beginning to measure it by access. But this calculation depended on timing. It assumed that trade rights would remain sufficient, that naval strength would expand gradually, and that no crisis would force a faster embrace of formal empire. History would soon test those assumptions. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared the American frontier closed. There was no longer a clear line separating settlement from wilderness. The Continental project that had defined the 19th century was effectively complete. Almost immediately, national attention began to drift outward. Naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan argued that modern power depended on sea control, overseas bases, and global reach. His writings influenced a generation of policymakers who believed the United States could not remain economically dominant without protecting trade routes across oceans. Shipyards expanded. Steel-hulled vessels replaced wooden fleets. The country was preparing for a broader role. Then came 1898. The Spanish-American War marked a decisive shift in American behavior. In defeating Spain, the United States acquired Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Hawaii was annexed the same year. For the first time, the United States openly governed territories thousands of miles from its mainland. This moment reveals something important about Africa. By the time America embraced overseas empire, the scramble for Africa had largely concluded. Between 1885 and the mid-1890s, European powers had partitioned almost the entire continent. Any new entrant would have needed to challenge an established colonial regime directly. That would have meant confrontation with Britain, France, or Germany, not Spain, a declining imperial power. The risks were higher. The military costs were greater. The diplomatic consequences were unpredictable. What might have been opportunistic expansion in the 1880s had become strategic entanglement by the late 1890s. American expansion after 1898 followed a different geography. The Caribbean protected sea approaches to the Gulf of Mexico and future canal routes. Pacific Islands supported trade with Asia. These acquisitions aligned with existing security concerns. Africa, distant and already divided, did not. By the time the United States possessed both the naval capacity and political confidence to consider formal empire seriously, Africa was no longer an open field. The hesitation at Berlin had quietly become a closed door. What remained was not a question of whether America could scramble Africa, but whether doing so would have altered its path to power at all. By the early 20th century, the answer had begun to reveal itself in practice rather than debate. The United States emerged from the Spanish-American War with overseas territories, but none in Africa. Its navy expanded steadily. Its industries outpaced most of Europe. Its banks financed projects across Latin America and beyond. And yet, its rise did not depend on African colonies. European empires had measured strength in acreage and flags planted across distant coasts. Their security calculations required territorial buffers, exclusive trade zones, and imperial prestige. For them, Africa was both competition and insurance, a way to secure resources and deny them to rivals. The United States operated under different structural conditions. It possessed vast agricultural land, abundant mineral wealth, and access to two oceans. Its internal market was enormous and still growing. Industrial output did not hinge on exclusive colonial supply chains in Africa. Trade agreements and open ports were sufficient. This difference in geography and timing shaped the choice made in Berlin. The United States did not scramble because it was not boxed in. It did not face the same strategic pressures as European powers. Its continental consolidation had given it breathing room, and breathing room allowed calculation. Even when America turned outward at the end of the century, its expansion followed shipping routes rather than territorial frontiers. Influence flowed through naval bases, financial leverage, and commercial access. Territorial ownership became selective, not compulsive. In retrospect, the absence at Berlin was less a rejection of power than a reflection of confidence. The United States did not need to divide Africa to become a global force. Its scale, industry, and hemispheric dominance were already setting the trajectory. By the time the 20th century reshaped global politics, it was clear that empires could be built in more than one way. Europe had drawn lines across Africa. The United States had drawn railroads across a continent and sea lanes across oceans. And in the long arc of its rise, that proved enough.